Okay, so everybody, we are going to be covering a couple of your upcoming assignments first today, and then if we have time at the end, we're going to do some charcoal drawing. Um, your notes for today will primarily just be like notes that you jot down in terms of like what I cover. I would expect to see like a little bit of notation surrounding the concept of the sublime that I'm going to talk about. Also, I would encourage you to write down the names of the artists that we cover today in both lectures that you um, have an interest in. Okay, so this first project we're going to talk about is your emotional landscape project, and that's going to be due on the 28th. For this assignment, you're actually going to be going outside into the landscape to draw. I don't want you to work from any photographs. And so the reason that this is the requirement, well, you have to start on site. You can finish with a photograph, but the initial drawing has to be done on site. I revised that recently when we went online. So the concept around this assignment is to start to help you to create a emotional relationship to your materials. So you remember with the last lecture that I gave about materiality with the Seurat, we focused a lot on the materiality of a work of art and how the materials that we choose to work with affect and speak to certain types of conceptual elements. So, we looked at Kehinde Wiley, we looked at Kerry James Marshall, Janet Gribben. These are all artists, Zorn, that are using materials in very specific ways to have a discussion around, in the case of that lecture, like identity. And so once we start to speak to materials, we start to bring in new opportunities for language. And, I say this a lot to you all, but like, the act of drawing is the act of speaking. And this is all about visual language. So what you're actually seeing here is one of my drawings from my thesis project when I got my bachelor's degree. I was working a lot with something that still really interests me, which is sight, in terms of like a specific place, like the site as a place, as a location of an experience or memory. So when I do my memorial garments and they start off with a Google Earth screenshot of a location, like this is me thinking about like the specificity, sorry, of a site and a place. And so these drawings that I made were all, they were in some aspects a self-portrait. They were drawings of England, in particular this area of England that my family is all from. So I'm actually the only person not born on the Isle of Sheppey. And just like the name implies, there's a lot of sheep there. There's less sheep now, it's more of a holiday island, but it used to be just kind of sheep and docks. So the Isle of Sheppey is west of London, about 2 hours. I was born in London, but the rest of my family were all born on this little island. And west side of the island is the British Channel, and the east side of the island is an estuary that is formed by the Swale and the Thames River joining. And this is actually taken from the estuary, the Swale and Thames estuary. And this is something which, is a place of spirit, I suppose. I'm not necessarily like a spiritual person, but spirit in the sense of the awe of nature. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, which is the sublime and the way that the sublime manifests itself in our relationship to nature. So I'd never really seen anywhere that had clouds like this area of England until I moved over to the Pacific Northwest. And I just love clouds. I'm not to sound like Bob Ross, but I do. I love looking at clouds. And there are those moments where, like here in this drawing, where the light breaks through the clouds and there's just this, there's a moment when something is happening that you cannot describe and it touches your soul. And for me, this was one of those moments. So there was about 10 drawings in this body of work that I created, and it's one of the only bodies of work I ever really sold out of. I sold all of the drawings. They're charcoal on cotton rag paper, which is just a higher end type of paper than what y'all are working on. So at the core of this discussion of the emotional landscape is the idea of the sublime. The sublime is a concept that had a huge impact on Romanticism. So Romanticism is occurring in the West, both North America and Europe, in conjunction with the Industrial Revolution. So you can kind of imagine that prior to the Industrial Revolution, we basically have the period we call the Enlightenment. And so like the Enlightenment was a period where like families would get together and do science experiments in their living room. And that was like a fun Friday night. There was a deep interest in science and sort of demystifying nature. And it was also a time when like, people would see a splash in the river and they would say it was a sea monster. And then like scientists so-called would like all get behind this one person's sighting and a new species would be created. And so it was definitely a period of time when there was a lot of pseudoscience like phrenology, and there was a lot of great advancements made simultaneously during the Enlightenment. So the Industrial Revolution kind of built out of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution like kind of overlap, right? In terms of like historical period. And with the Industrial Revolution, you suddenly have the mechanization of labor, and you have the ability for the mass consumption of the material world. And so kind of what comes out of this is a spiritual rebellion that we link to Romanticism, which would be like sort of like the next period that would come after Neoclassicism. And so the Romantics have a huge influence on the Impressionists, for instance. And so when we think about the Romantic period, we're thinking about writers like Thoreau, who wrote Walden, or in particular, the most famous Romantic writer that comes to my mind is like Mary Shelley. And think about what Mary Shelley is writing about when she writes about Frankenstein. And I know that I'm stuck on a slide and I'm sorry, but Mary Shelley writes this story, and the story isn't just about the story is wrongly named, right? It's not the book shouldn't really be called Frankenstein. It should be called The Monster, because it's not really about Frankenstein. But really what the book is looking at is the fear of science becoming so advanced that humanity can overpower nature, and all the bad things that are going to happen when that occurs. You've also got Bram Stoker's Dracula written at the same time period. And these books are sort of like indications of the way that people are kind of watching what's happening around them during this huge moment of science and industry. and being like kind of trying to take a step back a little bit, and examine what's happening. And all of these ideas are not necessarily like anti-science, but they are like a warning. Like Frankenstein is a warning. And those books are like linked to ideas of romanticism, and this idea that like no matter with Frankenstein, no matter how smart humans think they are, nature will always find a way, to use a quote from like Jurassic Park. And so romanticism is kind of built in this space of returning humanity to a place where it is reminded of the awe of nature. So what you see like in terms of like figurative painting is the switch where you may have, let me pull this up so we can see, you may have a painting from let me pull up an Ingres painting, neoclassicist painting here, and say, okay, so like let's grab this giant lie of a painting, which is Napoleon crossing the Alps on a white steed. Let's see if I can grab this. Okay, and then I'm going to pull up Caspar David Friedrich. And this is probably the most famous painting by him. Okay. So let's compare these two paintings together. Let me pull them up for you all. And this, I know this is annoying everybody, but I really like to teach this way. Let me pull this up. I like this way of teaching because it shows you what knowledge can allow you to do. I think that's really exciting. So here we have actually, Gwen, can you see the screens with the paintings? Yeah, okay. So actually over here on the left, here's a portrait of Ingres, right? This is Ingres. So this is a painting by Ingres. Neoclassicism, okay? So a new classic way of painting. Napoleon crossing the Alps on a white steed. Napoleon crosses the Alps on a donkey. He doesn't cross the Alps on a white steed. So I like to think of this as a great lie. So look how big Napoleon is, look how big the horse is, and then look at nature. Okay, Napoleon conquers the Alps. Now look at this painting by Caspar David Friedrich. Look how small the figure is within the setting of nature. These are two very different ideas. This is the domination of nature, and this is the sort of the submission to nature. Here's another Caspar David Friedrich, also very important. Here. Again, look how small the people are, and look how gigantic nature is. So these are very different movements, not very far behind one another, Romanticism coming after Neoclassicism. And I think one of the things, like when I think about this movement, when I think about Romanticism, it's so deeply ingrained in the sort of way in which humanity has chosen to consume nature, under the belief that nature is mankind's material to conquer. Romantics aren't necessarily anti-industry. They're just kind of like, in some cases, watching what's happening around them. And in other cases, they actually may be saying, hey, like, hold on, like take a step back, for instance, like with people like Thoreau and Emerson. Or you could even think about like Moby Dick by Melville as a romantic tale. So at the core of Romanticism, and this all sort of starts with this German writer whose name is Goethe, is this notion of the sublime. Okay, and Goethe was a writer. He wrote about nature. He's also the originator of complementary colors, which were very popular with the sort of the families that engaged in science as a pastime. The concept of after effects, where like you look at a green screen and it has a red square, and then you know turn off the screen like a projector, and all you can see is a green square with a red screen background. And so like this concept of After Effects became a very popular parlor activity, as was the utilization of pyramids to create spectrums of light that could be refracted. And of course, from that, we get like Newton kind of like thinking about all light is made from all color, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all happening around this time. So when we look at someone like Goethe, we start to see these like thematic sort of concepts of nature over humanity rather than humanity over nature. An artist who was greatly influenced by Goethe is Turner. Okay, so this is by J.W.M. Turner. Turner is one of my favorite painters of all time. I was raised on Turner. He's quintessential British painting for sure. Turner is a British painter. He is well known from a very young age as being like a painter to watch. He starts off very young by selling watercolors in his father's barber shop. Now, his father was a barber to very high-end politicians and aristocrats. And so they would see his watercolors and then they would get involved. And some of them, even at an early age, like helped pay for him to have lessons. And then at a later age, they would help pay for him to travel all over Europe and do walking tours. And while he would walk all over Europe, he would paint. So he has different periods. He's probably known the most for his watercolors and paintings like this, these like naval paintings, okay? So this painting is called The Fighting Temeri Being Pulled to Her Last Berth to be Broken Up. And this is a really complicated and complex painting. Like I said earlier, Goethe gives us the writings about complementary colors and the way that complementary colors can affect each other. Now, this is based on the red, yellow, blue color wheel, which I don't really particularly, I'm not sort of like dedicated to. I also believe in the red, green, blue system. But, you know, basically this idea that like one color has an opposite color on a symmetrical wheel. And when sort of placed near each other, they vibrate because they have, you know, diametrically opposed like hues. And so we can look in here, we can see Turner playing with this idea of complementary colors. We have orange and blue, we have yellows, and we have like sort of these gray purples, or even down here, like these darker purpley browns. And so there's complementary colors that are being affected in here against one another. Now, it's important to recognize that Turner also worked at a time when chemical colors were becoming very popular. And so Turner loved some of these extremely unstable chemical colors. And so this painting may not have actually looked like this when he completed it. It may have looked different, just like with the Georges Seurat painting of the Island of Grand Jatte, how he used zinc yellow, and so it turned kind of like a green yellow. Turner would like kind of just like write down like the colors that he was using, and like everybody knows that he knew that these colors would change. So when we look at Turner today, we may not be looking at exactly what he painted, even though they've been restored. This painting is extremely complex compositionally. The painting kind of hinges right here on this buoy. I just used a red on a brown area that's very warm, so that didn't really show up. Let me change the color here. So that buoy in the water creates a extremely important counterbalance to the rest of all of this. Okay. This piece of wood here also does something similar, as this little lighthouse or house back here. So when we look at this painting compositionally, really, this whole painting would fall apart without this buoy. And one of the reasons why it's so important is because, like, look where the ship's going. So it's pulling us towards that area in that moment. And that's really important when we're looking at all this really hot color here. And so when we look at this painting, we really want to think about how did Turner play with us with composition. Now, the Fighting Temeri, which is this boat here, was one of the most famous British warships. It was at the Battle of Trafalgar, which was the naval battle where the British beat the French Armada. It was led by Nelson, Lord Admiral Nelson, who died and was put in the barrel and pickled. Was that Lord Admiral? Yes, that was Lord Admiral Nelson, and brought home. His ship was the HMS Victory. This is the HMS Temeri. And what we see is this magnificent sail ship, and it's giant, and it's being pulled along by this little tiny boat. And that little boat, as we can see, is mechanized. And what's fueling the mechanization of this little boat, this little paddle wheel here, is spinning, right, is steam. Now we know that Turner played with this boat's composition. In terms of like what really was there, this chimney was actually much more in the center of the boat. So he moved the chimney to create the composition that he needed, which is very much something painters do. But his interest here is like this idea right here of like the new pulling the old. We can also see that it's sunset. Okay, so the sun is going down. So we run into this question of like, okay, so industry is pulling nature because this is run by sail, right, by wind. And that sort of like ending of nature's power is being further endorsed by the symbol of the sunset. Now, in addition to that, this painting also is a memorial for Turner's friend who had died. And this is sort of like a symbolic memorialization of his friend being taken, towards death. This is considered to be one of the most recognizable paintings in all England. There was a poll, and this painting came up as one of the most recognizable paintings in England. So where are my slides? So the question is less about there they are. The question with Turner and other Romantic artists is less anchored to subject the way that a neoclassical painting is anchored to subject. When Ingres paints Napoleon being at his coronation, or Josephine being crowned Empress of France, every single face was studied and painted in exactness because it was the capture of a historical moment. Turner isn't doing that, although he does do that in his career to try to make money at certain kinds of events, particularly sea battles. He makes sea battle paintings that he tries to make money to survive as an artist from. and he will go and like take drawings of the sailors that were there and listen to their stories. But where Turner really astounds is in the spaces in which he is not listening to history. Instead, he's listening to the spirit. So on the left here, we see one of his paintings, one of his earlier paintings, very fashionable in this period, coming out of neoclassicism, which is like these classic tales. So this is like Theseus doing something. I can't remember what he's doing. Theseus battling the Cyclops or something like that. Right? And so, you know, Greek classic tale from the Iliad, and painted as a historical illustration. To the right of that is more of what Turner's like really known for, which are these sort of like stormy, very British weather depictions of nature versus some type of aspect of mankind, being used, that word being used here purposely as a historical marker. And so, you know, here's mankind on this little boat, but the sea, as we can see, is very dangerous. And the sky, we can see that there's a storm coming through. And maybe this little boat has just weathered a storm, because we can kind of imagine that with all the light on the left. Or maybe this boat is, you know, unable to reach safety. But there is a message here of the insignificance of humanity versus nature. That's a really key idea for this notion of the sublime. At the very bottom there is a later Turner, and it's either the Thames or Venice. I don't remember which one it is. But we can see that it's extremely abstracted. It's impressionistic even, and it's very much about light and color. So at the very end of Turner's life, Turner sadly was an alcoholic, and he managed to keep that from the public eye for most of his life. You know, at the end of his life, he was making these paintings that today we talk about as if they're like abstract expressionist works, but they were really just paintings he didn't finish. But the canonization of Turner as one of the greatest inventors of painting kind of like led to these like theories that he was painting just color and shape. And that's what I was taught too. But further research that I've done shows that, you know, people who are really knowledgeable about Turner know that these were paintings he was working on and were not finished. But they are extremely atmospheric, like this painting here on the bottom. And so you can see this huge range of difference between these different periods of Turner's painting. This painting here feels much more connected to just the nature of experience and the awe of nature's itself, right? Versus like this painting, which is just about, you know, Theseus versus the Cyclops back here, or whatever it is. I highly suggest you research Turner. He's just brilliant. One of my favorite stories about Turner is that someone came to see him in his studio, and his studio was like falling apart. And there are all these paintings in there, and there are holes in the paintings where he had cut holes in the paintings for his cats to jump through. He died in secret, like he had a secret life. Everyone thought this old man that lived on the street with this woman was a sea captain, but it was actually Turner. But they thought he was a sea captain because he would sit on the roof. He had a deck built on his roof, and he would sit up there and watch the clouds all day. So they figured the only thing he could be would be a sea captain. And he was living out of wedlock with his maid, basically. And when he died, it was only because a friend had kind of like followed him there secretly one day that they were able to go and find out that Turner had died. And so then they literally snuck his body out secretly on a stretcher and took him back to his more respectable quote unquote home. where he was like, this great national treasure. And that just really interests me as a painter and as a person who's, connects with people who are on the edges of sort of society as a trans person. I connect with Turner's story of needing to hide. He bequeathed everything to the people of England that he left. All his sketchbooks, all his paintings were all at the Tate in London, which has an entire Turner wing. It's really amazing. On the American side of the Romantic period, we have Frederick Church. Now, Church is actually one of the artists. Church and Moran were two Romantic painters who were sent by Congress to paint places like the Grand Canyon. And then they'd make studies and color paintings, like small paintings that could be traveled. And then they would go back to their studios in like New York and DC and make these really big paintings, which would be presented to Congress. And then Congress would see the majestic nature of these places that like Roosevelt was asking to, basically make national parks. And of course, it was simultaneously take away land that was indigenous land. But, that was the role that Church and Moran played. Church here we can see is painting two very different types of scenes. Compositionally, there's a lot of the same type of sectioning of the space into thirds. And so in landscape, we also often speak to the idea of thirds. Okay, so like, this is a third, like this is a third, and this is a third. So what's happening up here is balancing what's happening in here, and what's happening in here is balancing what's happening in here. Now you've also got foreground, middle ground, and background as well. And what's important to sort of recognize is how is Church manipulating us in these paintings? So like look down here, right? We have all this highly detailed, pretty contrasty sort of space. Okay. And then we have this more like middle ground. It's still got some details, but it's still pretty, it's still got a lot of color, but it's not as sort of saturated. And then we have all this background space, right, which is pretty desaturated. Just because it's desaturated doesn't mean it's not important, because it is. One of the things that Church here is trying to balance is a super, super, super hot sun. And so look how, he balanced that. He balanced that by sort of creating this space and almost like sectioning it off. And then there's all this blue sky here, which is counterbalancing all of this orangey red sky over here. And then even down here, we have all this really hot, hot yellow on this brown and then the green mixed in. And so all that hotness is like pulling us down here, balanced by this sort of white, cool white in here. And so there's lots of different ways that Church is manipulating us around this space. We also have a rule of thirds here too, where like we have a third there and a third here. And so then the goal would be like, what do you do in this third to balance what's in this third to balance what's in this third? So both of these paintings actually have pretty similar compositions in terms of like the location of the light source. Right? And then what you need to do is think then like, how did he balance from there? Now the one on the left I really like, because as much as Florida is a scary place for queers like me, especially right now, it's a very beautiful place. And it reminds me of Florida a lot, and canoeing down rivers where the heat is coming off of the water, and it's just beautiful. It's a really beautiful place. The politics are just not very friendly for people like me. When we look at this piece by Church, look how cool all this is. It's moist, right? Like it's very humid versus like this, which is hot. And there's a lot of heat here. And so these two paintings both depict different types of their palettes, but they're also full of different types of like um, language speaking to like the inner spirit, the soul. And so this may be a shock to the soul, right? A volcano going off. This is a dangerous situation. This may be more calming to the soul. And so the sublime is kind of like being pulled in there with like this undescribable feeling that you get when you see a situation. And you may have had a similar experience. Maybe you've been lost in a trail or in a mountain and you've had that experience. There were many days in Florida where I went surfing and you'd see a shark, and there was like this experience that you had of like, fear, get your hands and feet out the water, hope you don't get knocked off your board. But then afterwards, there's like this majesty of that. There's this like, this moment where the wave tastes sweeter, the water feels different, because of this like, this sublime moment where like you were looking at the awe of the power of nature. Ryder is another American painter who does this, I think, really well. Now, the painting on the left, believe it or not, is like Brooklyn or New York. And it's really not until the Industrial Revolution really takes off in New York that you suddenly get the type of city that it starts to become like today. Prior to that, it was all farmyards, lots of wide open farms in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, windmills. It was a very different place than what it is today. The painting on the left reminds me of the Tim Burton movie about Sleepy Hollow, because he goes up to upstate New York to a family there that has windmills. It just reminds me of that. But in both of these paintings, look at the difference, right? We have the moon, but yet here we have the sun. And so the moon, as you get like dusk, right? That there's something, somewhat scary, I think about that. And like it makes me think about like the feeling I get when I think about like Edward Gorey and like the Victorian notion of horror, like the Gothic. And so here we see, an individual walking along this path in the moonlight. So one person against all of this nature. One windmill against all of this nature. So again, that's going to be something you're going to see in Romanticism, which is the lack of emphasis on humanity and the increased emphasis on nature. Ryder's a really interesting artist in the sense that he would paint on like cigar boxes and things, and he'd actually have painting parties where he would have like friends over to help him paint his work. And people talked about how like he would have a poker in the fire and he would like paint a scene, and then he would drag the red hot poker through the scene to create lightning. It is, I have read that he would use pigments that he knew would age and change over time, so his paintings would change their appearance. Like it was a conceptual idea that his paintings would change the older they were. And that's just like a really contemporary idea, but he was thinking about this at the turn of the 1900s. I think you can look to people like Albert Pinkham Ryder for a lot of American Gothic sensibility. I think he was really in tune with that, especially with like the Romantic period. Don't forget, this is also the time of like Walt Whitman, that turn of the 1900s, who, when Walt Whitman was living in Brooklyn, Brooklyn was a very well-known area for gay men and gay women. And Walt Whitman was part of that movement of gay poets that were alive during the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. This is a contemporary artist. Her name is April Gornick. And these are more like what you're going to be creating. These are graphite and charcoal on paper. And I find her work to be incredibly moving and incredibly, romantic. Here we have this darkened foreground and sort of a lighter middle ground, and then an extremely light background. Very subtle gradation of value in the sky. I don't know if you can even see it on your laptops. But what's nice here is this composition with a silhouetted tree coming down and becoming a composite shape. Y'all, that is Servo's drawing without drawing. I mean, technically what he's making a lot of times is composite shapes where forms become each other through the relationship of value. Even here where we have this movement of this tree through to here, do you see all of that composite shape is a shape that is creating compositional thrust. So that thrusts us down to here, pulls us over to here, and then maybe we just go back up this tree and come along and go over into this space and then down through here. These things aren't accidental, y'all. When you're painting, when you're drawing, it's not an accident to create the composition. It's an extremely important element of how you compose a successful drawing. There's a difference between like just sitting down and making a drawing and sitting down and like looking and digesting and thinking about the placement of form within your pictorial space. A lot of times painters like myself will use our camera to do that. Like I'll take a picture and then I'll crop the picture, try different crops before I decide on a composition. But I also still sit and I sketch, and I sketch out the way that the way in which we like experience space and the way in which we make a decision to distribute form through space. So like over here, I think is a really nice example of that, which is like, how does this space here, that white space, balance against this darker space over here? Is there a balance here that's occurring? Yeah, totally. And it's also occurring through like this area here, all that darkness versus these three bright moments. Okay, so one of the things that you want to think about when you are going to start this drawing is the composition, the pictorial space. If we go back up to Ryder here, we can say, well, he's going to pull us in through here. That leads us over here. Maybe we see the sun come down. Maybe that goes through here, up again, over, out. And maybe the last place we come in is here. Maybe for you, it's a totally different experience. But there is a considered decision-making process here of where to place form, where to place color, and where to create composition. So what you're going to be doing for this project is you're going to go out to seek something which is sublime. So sublime in the sense of like um, the thing you cannot connect to, the awe of nature. So you're going to be working with charcoal on the mixed media paper because you're going to do a big drawing, 24 by 18. And you're going to be working only with value. And your goal is going to be looking at the ways in which you can build a space through the development of balance. So like the balance between light and dark, the balance between, different shapes, the balance between contour and mass. And so you're really going to be responsible with this drawing to design as much as to observe and render. So this student, her name was Wansu, and she created this drawing, and she showed me her studies, and she showed me her photograph, and she said to me like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to create all these trees that have fallen in here? So we talked about mark making and symbolic drawing. And so now we start to like, remember when we started with like a lot of drawing in this class, and I was like, whatever you do, don't think about symbols. Well, once we enter into like Impressionism, we start to think about how we, like a lot of ways in which we think about like, how do we signify? Okay, so remember that the Impressionists were called the Impressionists because they were deemed as being only worthy to give an impression of something. And that means that they were using sometimes some type of sign and signifier to indicate whether it was a reflection on the lake or if it was a tree. So we get there into like a discussion around like mark making, and we get into a discussion around the application or subtraction of material. So when I look here and I look all through this lower area of the drawing with all of these trees, the one tree that stands out purposefully is this first tree here. And you can see that she's going to bring us into the compositional space with a thrust up, a thrust over, and then we kind of enter into the middle ground. Now, because of the distance of the fallen trees in the middle ground, we don't need to see them in the same detail as here, right? If we did, we're going to see a whole flattening of this space because everything will read like it's right in front of us and really close, and that will just be the end of that. Like it will just flatten out. So we need to think about like how much detail does this need versus how much detail does this space need? And she's done that by sort of like taking these larger forms and telling us what they are specifically. And then as we take a step back, they're no longer specific, but we've already met that form here. We've already been introduced to the form. And so as we move back, we have the knowledge that this line here signifies this form. And it's not just that that's happening, it's also your experience as a person who's walked somewhere and seen a fallen tree. And that is informing you. That's like informing your ability to read these symbols for what they are. The same thing with her trees, right? Like the trees are very open. They are not individual leaves. This is area and mass and value versus depiction. She's depicting a very small quantity of information, but it's being effectively utilized to translate tree to us as individuals. It's another example from a student. It's quite simple, but still a nice drawing. We have that deck that is coming through the space in a very straightforward one-point perspective approach. It's balanced with this horizontal deck. And then all of this darkness is balanced by this light. And this student, he worked really hard all quarter, but it really wasn't until he did this drawing that things really like came together for him. And we just see that a lot as teachers. And I don't think it matters what subject you teach. We see this moment where everything clicks together. And like, those are the moments that you teach for, because those are the moments where you know that like you've opened up somebody to something new. And that's what happened with this individual with this drawing. It was really cool. The student lived in North Bend, and this is out towards Twin Peaks. I'm a fan of Twin Peaks, the show, and she knew that, and she, told me that she made this thinking about showing me the road to Twin Peaks, which is what this is. Very subtle drawing in the background, very subtle, but really dynamic. And we have this really nice curve that's thrusting us around this corner. And all that bright light of the road balanced by the dark of the trees and the bushes and the grass. I think a very impressive composition. And then that one tree right in the center, that's just a silhouette against these soft, subtle mountains. This student gave me this drawing in critique, and I said to her, like, is this a place that you're scared to go? And she said, no, it's where I take my kids to play. And I was like, wow, I don't think I would want to go play here as a kid. Like, the extremely moody, very dark, to me, a very scary image. And the way that we have these really long shadows, and then the silhouette of the swings and the silhouette of these, trees in the background with all these branches going up into the air at diagonals, which indicate energy and movements of thrusting us up and down, up and down, up and down through this back space. I just think it's a very potent drawing, and still one that I'm quite fond of using for this lesson. Really nice, very simple drawing. I think that this was another student whose work really jumped with this assignment. And you have to watch it then, because then I'm watching you to check for growth on the next assignment. You know what I mean? Like, so you gotta keep it in check. Don't suddenly completely kill this project and then for the next project do something dreadful. You have to keep it, every drawing raises the bar a little bit. I'm of course joking. I want that bar raised every single time the student raised the bar on this drawing, and did a really great job. It's nice and simple. I like the balance. And I think overall it's an interesting piece. Is it sublime? I don't know. I don't know if it's quite so sublime. I feel like that's sublime. I feel like this is teetering on the sublime with like this, but the road is a nice sort of indication of humanity versus nature. This definitely feels sublime to me. This feels very sublime to me. I don't know if this feels super sublime, but it's still a nice drawing. So you're going to follow the instructions. Okay, I think they're pretty clear. We'll go over them. You have to draw on location first. You have to take a selfie on location with your drawing materials at the beginning of your drawing session and at the end, so I can see that you drew on location. And then this is an expressive drawing, so it shouldn't be representational, but it can't also just be like a bunch of nothing. It has to be something which is strong, okay, in terms of like your thought and your process. So let's quickly look at the handout here. Okay, so this kind of gives you a little bit of an introduction here. So your goal is to develop a drawing that reflects on your emotional response to the landscape that surrounds you. I'm not unaware of how hard it is right now to get around. I won't tell you what to draw or where to draw, but my feeling is that if you go somewhere you're interested in, your drawing will be better. If you go somewhere that you're less interested in, or you just walk out your front door and you draw and then you walk back inside, like there's not going to be a lot of connection to what you're drawing. You know, I want you to draw something that interests you. And I also want you to think about, like, if you are still struggling with perspective, you might not want to do like a bunch of buildings. You know, you can draw anything in nature, and natural forms are organic, and they're a heck of a lot easier to draw than buildings if you're struggling with perspective still. Okay, so kind of think a little bit about like what it is that you want to do. Don't be afraid to like take on a challenge. I'm not telling you don't take on a challenge, but what I'm saying is, like, when you pick your location, like truly go and pick it. Like, go and find it. Like, go find that place that speaks to you. You know, if it means grabbing a ride from your parents, grab a ride from your parents. You know what I mean? Like, go and seek something that awakens your soul in some way. Since you have to start on location and you have to take selfies on location, this can't be a drawing of somewhere you went when you were 6. Okay. And I did that on purpose. I don't want those drawings. Those drawings are all based on memory. I want this experience right now to influence what you draw. So you're going to be evaluated on the fulfillment of the requirements, the evidence of your effort, exploration of the landscape as in the personal experience, your use of materials, and completion by the deadline. Okay. So you must draw on location. So here we're going to start number 2. You must draw on location, and you cannot work from the photograph. Initially, when you arrive at your site, set up to draw and take a selfie of your drawing set up and location. Make sure your drawing is visible in the frame. Y'all, I had to tell you, this is one of my favorite parts of the whole quarter. I love getting these selfies. They're so much fun. I don't share them. They don't go anywhere else. These are just for me to know that you did the work I want, the way I wanted it to be done. But this is honestly, especially right now, because I don't get to see so many of you, it's great for me to like actually see you. But if you're not comfortable, you can always just have your hands visible in the picture, okay? On mixed media or pastel paper, do some studies. You can do some studies on pastel paper if you like, okay? But just remember, when you go to the larger drawing, which is on mixed media, there will be a material change there, and that materiality may affect the outcome of the drawing. Once you've done your studies, how many? I don't know. I suggest at least 2 or 3. Tape down a sheet of 24-inch by 18-inch mixed media paper. Begin your drawing with your vine charcoal and mass in all of the landscapes you see. So you're going to draw with the edge of your tool, and I want you to cover the entire page with a very simple gestural drawing. I don't want you to sit and try to draw one tree for 2 hours. You won't finish the drawing. I want you to draw the entire space. Use your chamois, use your erasers, use your fine charcoal, really get into the drawing and really start to activate the page. Work on the drawing as much as you can on location, and at the end of your drawing session, take another selfie. Make sure that the drawing is in the frame. That way I know you've been there. I'm asking you to be there for at least 2 hours, okay? Something to consider too is you're going to then take a photograph to use to finish your drawing. Make sure you take it from exactly the place you drew from. So if you were seated, you shouldn't take your photograph from standing up, because you're going to get a totally different point of view. Think about your perspective. Using your photograph when you're experiencing the drawing session, finish the drawing. Don't lose the expressive quality of being on location, but do refine elements of the drawing. I would fix your drawing outside with your fixative, and then make a Word document with your selfies, your studies, and your final drawing, all those things in your Word document, and upload them to the assignment. Okay. So your requirements are right here highlighted: selfies taken on location, a number of studies from your location in charcoal, a final 24-inch by 18-inch drawing on mixed media paper. And here's a little evidence for you that I go out to the landscape and work, even though my work isn't about the landscape. This is me in the basin of the White River out at Mount Rainier on a very, very beautiful day. And it was a very fun memory I have. You can make this fun. You can go somewhere fun. You can make this a day trip. Okay, so this is due on the 28th at 9:30, so I can see it before the class. And that's your next assignment to do. If you haven't already started the eyes are due on the 25th.